Roxy Music, the band Bryan Ferry formed in 1971, released 7 albums, and Bryan has now released his 7th solo LP, Bête Noire. Bryan was in Australia a couple of weeks ago to talk about his music, and the conversation I had with this very charming man was recorded at the Metro nightclub in Melbourne. But first, the right stuff. Well, here you are, and without a band. Does this mean you're likely to tour sometime in the near future?
I'd like to think so, yes. Having done the live TV show the other night, which was in fact with an Australian band, which I was very impressed by.
You should have been very impressed. I thought it was wonderful.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I try not to see those things, but at the time it felt that they were very, very good. And just before Christmas I did a live thing in New York, a benefit, and so I seem to be edging towards it without really wanting to playing live again. Obviously it would help if I had a fixed group, which I hadn't at the moment, just a lot of floating players. And but if I can get the next album done in reasonably short order, you know, I'd like to get out again in perhaps in a fairly controlled way.
Have you begun work on the next album?
Not yet. No, I've been promoting furiously this one since it came out really in November. A lot of places around Europe, a lot of TV shows and things like that. So nothing I could really get my teeth into much in terms of performance. But I've just been spending so long in the studios making the last 3 albums that the performance thing, the touring thing, has become much taken a back seat kind of thing as far as work goes.
Do you actually like the physical time spent working in the studio?
No, I wish I could spend less time there. But to get things right, the more complicated it gets, obviously the longer you spend, and the more players you have, and the more different kinds of players from different styles of music, the more difficult it gets to make things work, I suppose. Compared with, say a nucleus of 4 people and you just bang away. That can be fun, but I've been trying to do something different from that.
Do you actually go into the studio with a definite idea of what you want to achieve? Or
Some days you do. Some days you do. But if you're talking about the album overall, no. The only preconceived idea I had before we started this one was I wanted the thing to be a bit more dynamic than Boys and Girls, and a bit more kind of fun and more kind of outward going, a little bit less introspective, which is kind of difficult for me, I suppose, anyway. But Boys and Girls had been particularly like that, and a lot of people found it rather sad. So at the outset, I thought it'd be interesting to co-write with some people, and that produced some interesting results, I thought. So one person I worked with was Johnny Marr, and who's very, very popular. Faces light up whenever I mention his name. It's great.
It's a nice combination.
It was, rather, and we got on very well. And he did this show with me in New York just before Christmas as well, which was fun to do. And I hope we can definitely do more. And he wanted to do some live things, more live things, but I had to really come and do this promotion thing.
Are you as painstaking about writing your lyrics as you are when you actually get into the studio?
The lyrics take an awful lot of effort and time, and that's obviously something you do when the others aren't there, when the other musicians or engineers or whatever are not there, and you spend most time kind of tearing them up, actually, because it's very hard to get it right, to get the words to match the music properly, to get them to marry together. You can write kind of poetic lines by the dozen, but to get them to sing right, I find I'm constantly kind of changing things, and sometimes you have to change the melody or whatever. And so each song goes on a kind of journey, really, when you start it. I tend to take a sketch into the studio, really, and then it goes from there. And it's a kind of very interesting but fairly long path sometimes to get to where you feel, oh, this is where it should stop, and this is the right place for it to be.
That's interesting. So you actually take an image in your mind, or actually on a piece of paper?
Well, it's usually a kind of cassette thing. I would sort of do something on piano or keyboard, and then it goes from there. And then I tend to work with the musicians one by one, So you find all these really interesting musicians play together on the same piece of music, but they never meet each other. So you can have people from obviously different age groups, different countries, different races, different nationalities, all on the same sort of record, which I think is very interesting. One of the more interesting things on the album was the title track, Bête Noire, where it had a kind of tango rhythm, and I liked the kind of the melodrama of tango music, and also the rhythms of it always feel very good to me. And so I got some real players from Argentina who were on tour, and I'd seen them before, a couple of years before, in New York, and met up with them again in LA, and these are guys in their 60s or something, and didn't speak any English, and I don't speak Spanish, and it was just a real music.
Music's universal anyway.
Yeah, it absolutely speaks louder than words, and I like that thing where people just relate to the feeling of the music, and you don't really have to say much to them, they just know instinctively that this is what is right, and that was very exciting for me.
Do you find it hard to come by producers who are equally as happy as spending such a long time on an album?
No. Not at all. No, they generally don't work in that way. I think part of the thing is that I come from an art background, and 2 years on a project doesn't seem that long to contemporaries of mine who are painters, you see. Between shows, that's about normal time to work up a dozen pictures or something, And but producers in music tend to expect it to be done in 3 months or whatever. And but I've managed to work with lots of very good people in my time. Producers. Chris Thomas, who's obviously doing things in Australia now with In Excess, done incredibly well. Chris was great. Usually I work with people for a few albums, and then we kind of move on to different things. Brett Davis is another one. He actually worked with Icehouse, another of your groups, trying to work in a bit of local talent. And they did some very good things too with Brett. And on this album was Patrick Leonard, who'd worked with Madonna, and Chester Kamen, who's a guitarist I've worked with.
I didn't know who he was.
Well, he played on Boys and Girls a lot, and he's sort of young English guitarist, and he did the Live Aid show at Wembley. He's got a younger brother called Nick Kamen, who's a singer.
Had he any other producing credits prior to working with you?
No.
Oh, that's interesting.
It was like a sort of sash of merit, really, the credit for sticking with me through the early stages of the record. I worked with Chester for a bit, and then with Patrick, and then the last, I guess, third of the album I did, in Paris on my own, to kind of tie it all together. But there again with a couple of different engineers, and very good ones too. Steve Jackson, who's young English. So I had a lot of kind of new young people with me on this album, as well as the old codgers from Argentina and various other people thrown in.
A lot of musicians say that they were surrounded by music in the early days as a child, and because of that, that tended to steer them into a musical career for them. Was that the case with you?
Well, let's see. Now, my Aunt Enid used to babysit me when I was very little, and she used to always play, what was it, Billy Eckstine and the Ink Spots and all kinds of great music. She was very hip, and that was my first kind of...
so you've got to thank Aunt Enid for...
Yeah, she still claims total responsibility for my success. Very little known fact. First revealed here at the Metro. So just keep a few things back, just for the right moment.
That's right. So what stage did you actually become involved with music?
And then when I was kind of 10 or something, I started going to concerts. my Uncle Bryan took me to the first jazz concert for City Hall in Newcastle, which is about the place you go and see people. And then from then on, I was on my own, and used to go and see Ella Fitzgerald, the Modern Jazz Quartet, all these kind of black blues artists and jazz people from America. I'd go and see and listen to, and just had this whole world of music in my head, which I couldn't really share with anybody at that time. And it was just my own thing, which is sometimes great for a child to have their own kind of little area, And my sister was my big sister, Anne. I'm getting all the info now, aren't you? Was a Little Richard fan and Elvis and Fats Domino, and I got into that kind of rock and roll area as well after a couple of years of being terribly snooty about it. It's not really very good music, that,
Not when you've come from Ella Fitzgerald.
Yeah, and so I sort of got to where I knew a bit about and liked and loved, lots of different kinds of music by the time I came to make any myself.
As a teenager, did you go to local venues and see people like the Animals, because they were also from Newcastle, and I guess they were almost a local band?
It's strange. Somehow I didn't. I was obviously aware of them, but yeah, they were very good. I used to go to a jazz club. I think I remember seeing Alan Price sitting in with the jazz people there. He was a very good jazz pianist. And I saw Eric Burden sitting in there as well, but I never saw the group as such like that. When I went to college, we had a group and we played in the local places, but doing kind of R&B things and not stuff I'd written. At that point, I had two separate things. In the daytime, I was an art student, and at night I was singing. Then a few years later, after I graduated, the two kind of merged together, and I suddenly thought I've got to try and put all my artistic energy or ideas or self-expression mode through music, and I managed to do it.
Why did that become so evident, moving yourself from art, sort of in the main area, to music?
I think I just felt myself drawn towards it. It just seemed like a more natural mode of expression for me. Maybe because it was a bit more physical. There was a physicality about it. You also had that kind of solitude thing, of course, when you're writing, when you can be on your own, and when you're painting a picture and you don't usually have an audience or anything, and the same when you're writing. But it also had this thing of sharing it with people. It seemed a modern way of communicating your ideas to a bigger audience rather than a very kind of elitist group of people who follow modern art,
It's very much more a performance.
And it just seemed a real challenge as well, to try and do something which you felt was kind of had some meaning, at least to me, to try and communicate that to a mass audience is really hard to do, and it's always a challenge to try and do it.
Well, Roxy Music really got off the ground very, very quickly. I mean, it was only, 2 or 3 years from the time when you actually began working together to having a first album and doing your first concerts in London. I mean, I was there then. I remember going to... Yeah, I went to... I think, from memory, it must have been one of your very first concerts. It was either at the Rainbow or at the Roundhouse, and it was about 72.
It would be the Rainbow, I think.
It was a fantastic experience.
Oh, great.
It
was for me.
It must have been, yeah. What was it like in those early days? I mean, it was quite a smorgasbord of music. There was Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and who else was big? Wishbone Ash.
Yeah, we didn't. That's right. Yeah, we didn't really fit into that that whir, as it were. So it did seem. I can understand how it seemed very different. We were very kind of inspired amateurs, in terms of playing proficiency or whatever. But we made up for it with our ideas and enthusiasm and all the rest of it. And we tried to do it with some sort of flair, One of my great influences on that had been seeing at the Roundhouse, funnily enough, in the late 60s, Otis Redding and the Stax Review, where they did fantastic music, and very soulful, obviously, and yet displayed in a great kind of with a great bravura, you know, and dancing all over the place in their great stage suits and everything. And that was a big sort of influence, I think, to say, oh yes, you know, you can perform this music without it detracting from the music. Do you know what I mean? Whereas a lot of the groups you mentioned was really just a case of playing the music and with not so much display, you know, at least not what you would call a hip display.
It was very much underplayed, whereas this is really very outrageous and throwing it back at the audience. In fact, the audience obviously loved it. I remember at that particular concert that there were quite a lot of people were dressed, emulating the band members. I mean, there were feathers and sequins and all sorts of shoes. I mean, it was really quite an experience for the audience, not just, you know, visually, musically, actually became involved with it, like an extension of the band members.
It was a wonderful club to belong to.
Yeah. You managed to keep your solo recording career going, you know, most of the time that Roxy Music were happening. What did your solo career and those solo recordings give you that you didn't get from the band?
Oh, it was a kind of breathing space from the real work. After the second album, Roxy album that is, I was pretty well burnt out, because it was one of my favourite records, but I worked very hard against the deadline to complete it and to write the songs. And I felt I'd made some sort of statement as a songwriter and whatever with those records. I thought, wouldn't it be great just for a change to do an album where I didn't have to write all the songs and could, you know, just treat it as an interpretive album of me as a singer and producer, arranger, whatever. You know, singing these great songs from the past, you know, varying different periods. You know, some from the 60s, some from the 50s, and right back to These Foolish Things, the title track. And that was great fun to do, and it was done very quickly, and it's like a breath of fresh air after the rather kind of desperate kind of intensity of For Your Pleasure, you know, which is still one of my favourite records.
It's definitely...
And so is These Foolish Things. It has some very good things about it, I think. It has a good, light-hearted feeling to it. And so that solo record did very well. You know, it was a little bit more accessible with its material than the Roxy things had been. And so I think it possibly helped to bring in a different audience, to add, you know, introduce them to the Roxy thing, which I felt was my proper job. And that solo thing turned into another separate career, which ran in parallel for a few years, for as long as I could do it. Finally, they merged together.
Roxy Music, to me, always felt that or appeared to be before their time. For instance, For Your Pleasure. I mean, 15 years ago, and I still play it on the radio, and it stands up as well as anything that's been released now. It's
well, that's very kind of you.
Don't you agree? It was
I like it
very experimental.
Yeah, when I was listening to it recently, well, a couple of years ago, we put together the Street Life compilation album, and it sounded quite current then. Yeah. And when I was doing this album, it's Bête Noire. For some reason, I kept thinking of For Your Pleasure as if it was like some of the elements of that were coming back to me. With this album, I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe it's just because the cover's dark. But it had a couple of things which reminded me of that time for some reason. I don't know. It's very odd. But that's the album I'd compare it with. Thank you.
Would you have considered the prospect of using Brian Eno as a producer?
Yes, I would. I think it would be very interesting to do. And I nearly, or just to play on a track or do something. Some collaboration would be interesting, because it's been a long, long time. And I saw Brian a couple of weeks ago in America. And we hadn't really spent any time together for 15 years, so it was kind of, we had a lot of catching up to do. So hopefully I'll see him when I get back to England. Even Andy Mackay, I saw very recently as well, a couple of days later. Would like to do some writing again, so all these things are possible.
So when you go back to England now, you're going to prepare to go back into the studio to work on this next album?
Pretty much. I think in May, I'd like to start getting the thing going again. The show on the road, as it were, studio-wise. And it's always exciting to already I'm feeling the urge to sort of start making something rather than talking endlessly about this one.
Well, I won't ask you what it's going to be about because I don't suppose you really want to sort of give that away.
No, not really. No. I don't even know.
Thank you for giving me your time. Anyway, it's lovely to have met you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.